In the sprawling, shadowed history of America's great dynasties, where fortunes are measured in billions and legacies are carved in oil and steel, few names conjure such a potent mixture of immense wealth and staggering tragedy as the Gettys. It is a story of ruthless ambition, lavish art collections, and a darkness so pervasive, so relentless, it became known throughout the world as the Getty Curse. We know the sensational headlines, the famously frugal patriarch, J. Paul Getty, who installed a payphone in his mansion for guests, the gruesome kidnapping of his grandson, where a severed ear was mailed to a newspaper, the string of untimely deaths, bitter family feuds, and crippling addictions that seemed to plague each successive generation. But hidden within this grand Gothic narrative of a family seemingly doomed by its own fortune, there is a story of survival that is rarely told in its full depth. It's the story of a forgotten heiress, a woman who inherited not just the family name, but all of its attendant demons. She was born into a gilded cage, and by every metric of her family's dark history, she was expected to become just another casualty, another sad headline in a cursed saga. Instead, after a harrowing journey through the abyss, she chose to defy her destiny, transforming the poison of her inheritance into a source of healing for thousands. This is the story of Aileen Getty, the woman who lived through the fire and has spent her life helping others find their way out of the flames. To truly understand Aileen, you must first understand the chilling, opulent, and emotionally barren world she was born into. The Getty family of the mid-20th century was less a warm, cohesive family unit and more a global corporation with a shared and heavily burdened last name. At its undisputed head was the formidable J. Paul Getty, a man who clawed his way to becoming the richest private citizen in the world by pioneering the vast oil fields of the Middle East. He was an undisputed industrialist genius, a visionary in business, but a deeply and profoundly flawed human being. His legend is built as much on his wealth as on his extreme, almost pathological stinginess. This wasn't just a quirky character trait, it was a philosophy that trickled down and poisoned the family dynamic. The stories are legion and revealing. His refusal to pay the initial ransom for his own grandson, his habit of meticulously hand-washing his own socks in hotel rooms to save on laundry bills, his aforementioned payphone. This frugality was the bizarre flip side of his immense wealth, and it created an environment of profound emotional scarcity. If a grandfather wouldn't spend his own money to save his grandson, what value was placed on love, affection, or emotional support? The Getty children and grandchildren were raised in a world of unimaginable material privilege, shuttled between grand European estates, sprawling ranches, and attended to by a full staff of nannies, tutors, and servants. Yet they were often starved of the one thing they craved: genuine parental attention and affection. J. Paul Getty had 5 sons from 5 different marriages, and his relationships with them were notoriously strained and distant. He treated his family almost like a corporate portfolio to be managed and occasionally audited, but never truly embraced. This was the world Aileen was born into in 1957. Her father was Sir John Paul Getty, Jr., one of the patriarch's most troubled and estranged sons, and her mother was Abigail Heiress, his first wife. Aileen spent much of her formative childhood in Italy, physically distant from the family's power centers in America and England, but never far from the long, cold shadow of its name. She and her siblings were, in essence, the children of a global empire, blessed with every luxury but burdened by a legacy of emotional neglect. It was an environment that bred a unique kind of pain, the deep existential loneliness that comes from being surrounded by everything but the one thing that truly matters. It was a perfect incubator for the rebellion and self-destruction that would later define her early life. Aileen's life story unfolds like a classic tragedy in 3 acts before its unexpected redemptive finale. The early years were defined by a quiet rebellion against the gilded cage she inhabited. She attended the most exclusive boarding schools, was presented to society as a debutante, and was expected to follow the well-trodden path of the international elite. A good marriage, a quiet life of leisure, and the careful stewardship of her trust fund. But Aileen possessed a restless, sensitive, and defiant spirit, one that was ill-suited to the rigid, emotionally sterile expectations of her dynasty. She was a Getty, but she never quite felt like she belonged in the world that name had built. As a young woman in the late 1970s and early 80s, she was swept up in the glamorous, fast-paced world of high society. This was the era of Studio 54, of globe-trotting socialites and a burgeoning punk rock scene. Aileen dabbled in it all, searching for an identity, for an authentic experience beyond the stultifying confines of her gilded life. In 1981, it seemed she had found a storybook escape. Aileen married Christopher Wilding, the handsome son of Hollywood legend Elizabeth Taylor. It was a union of 2 of the most famous families in the world, a match seemingly made in the boardrooms of gossip magazines. The wedding was a lavish affair, a spectacle of wealth and celebrity. Aileen, now the daughter-in-law of one of the most iconic women on the planet, was poised for a life of glamorous stability. She and Christopher had 2 sons, Caleb and Andrew, and for a brief, hopeful period, it appeared that Aileen might be the one to finally outrun the darker currents of her family's legacy. But the Getty curse, as the media had dubbed it, was not so easily evaded. The immense pressure of her name, the unresolved emotional trauma of her upbringing, and the seductive excesses of the 1980s party scene began to form a perfect storm. Beneath the glamorous surface of her life as a wife and mother, Aileen was struggling profoundly. And then came the first devastating blow. In 1984, at a time when the world was just beginning to grapple with a terrifying and mysterious new illness, then known as the gay plague, Aileen was diagnosed as HIV positive. In an era defined by rampant fear, grotesque stigma, and a complete lack of medical understanding, an HIV diagnosis was widely seen as an immediate death sentence. The source of her infection was never definitively publicized. Speculation ranged from an extramarital affair to a blood transfusion she had received years earlier. But in the cruel court of public opinion, the how didn't matter. She was a wealthy, married mother, and she had contracted a disease that the world ignorantly and viciously associated with marginalized communities. She instantly became a public face of a plague that terrified the world. The fairy tale marriage to Christopher Wilding, already strained, completely crumbled under the weight of the diagnosis and the intense public scrutiny. They divorced in 1989. This profound personal health crisis sent Aileen into a catastrophic tailspin. She descended into a severe, all-consuming addiction to heroin and cocaine, a desperate and predictable attempt to numb the physical fear of a terminal illness and the deep emotional pain of her collapsing world. She became a fixture in the tabloids, no longer the glamorous heiress, but a ghoulish cautionary tale. The paparazzi photos from this era are shocking. She was rail-thin, hollow-eyed, clearly in the grips of a powerful addiction, all while battling a deadly virus. It was during this dark period that one of the most harrowing and rarely discussed incidents of her life occurred. Her own father, Sir John Paul Getty Jr., in what was likely a misguided and desperate attempt at a tough love intervention, publicly announced that he was cutting her off from her family trust fund. His hope, presumably, was that hitting rock bottom financially would force her into sobriety. Instead, the act of public disinheritance pushed her further into the margins, leaving her feeling utterly and completely abandoned by the family she already felt estranged from. She was at the absolute bottom, a forgotten casualty of a family that seemed to eat its own young. By all accounts, this is where her story should have ended, with a tragic overdose or a quiet succumbing to her illness. But it was here, in this moment of absolute darkness, that Aileen Getty's true story, the story of her incredible survival and rebirth, began. The turning point for Aileen was not a single dramatic event, but a slow, arduous, and painful journey back to herself. It was a journey fueled by a remarkable and previously untapped inner strength, and, crucially, the unwavering support of a few true friends, most notably her former mother-in-law, the legendary Elizabeth Taylor. While the world saw Aileen as a tragic, disgraced figure, Taylor saw something else, a fellow survivor. Elizabeth Taylor, more than almost anyone in Hollywood, understood the crushing weight of fame, public scrutiny, and personal tragedy. Having co-founded the American Foundation for AIDS Research and AMFAR in 1985, after the death of her friend Rock Hudson, she was one of the first and most fearless public advocates in the fight against HIV/AIDS. When others were running from the disease in fear, Taylor ran towards it with compassion and fury. She wrapped Aileen in a cocoon of fierce maternal love and support. She shielded her from the harsh glare of the media, used her considerable influence to connect Aileen with the best medical care available at a time when effective treatments were still in their infancy, and simply offered her a non-judgmental shoulder to lean on. Taylor's fierce loyalty and profound compassion were a lifeline for Aileen, a stark contrast to the conditional support she had received from her own family. This bond, forged in a time of crisis, was instrumental in Aileen's eventual recovery. Aileen herself has spoken about this period with an incredible and disarming candor. She once gave a quote that reveals the depth of her self-awareness, saying of her vast inheritance, large amounts of money are very toxic. It's a very unfortunate substance to have. This profound insight, the recognition that the very thing the world coveted was a source of poison in her own life, was the key to her transformation. She came to understand that to heal herself, she had to fundamentally change her relationship with her wealth, her name, and her legacy. She could no longer be a victim of her circumstances. She had to become the architect of her own purpose. Her recovery from drug addiction was a brutal day-by-day, minute-by-minute battle. But as she began to heal, as she started the long road back to sobriety, she found a new and powerful reason to live, the desire to use her own painful lived experiences to help others. She had seen the absolute worst of addiction. She had experienced the terror of homelessness, and she knew firsthand the deep, cutting stigma of living with HIV. She understood in a way that few people of her immense social standing ever could the profound loneliness and soul-crushing despair of those living on the absolute margins of society. Her empathy was not theoretical. It was not the detached sympathy of a distant benefactor. It was real, raw, and forged in the fires of her own suffering. This newfound purpose gave her a reason to fight not just for her own life, but for the lives of countless others who were still lost in the darkness she had just escaped. The rebellious, self-destructive Heiress was slowly, painstakingly being reborn as a compassionate and determined activist. It was a quiet, intensely personal revolution, one that took place far from the flashing bulbs of the paparazzi that had once defined her public existence. She was no longer just a Getty. She was Aileen, a survivor on a mission to prove that redemption was possible. The public narrative of Aileen Getty's life has often been framed by controversy, but a closer and more compassionate look reveals a story of remarkable resilience in the face of immense public judgment and misunderstanding. The central controversy of her life was, of course, her HIV diagnosis and the rampant, cruel speculation that surrounded it. It is difficult to overstate the terror and ignorance that defined the AIDS crisis in the 1980s. It was not just seen as a medical condition. It was viewed by many as a moral failing, a punishment for a deviant lifestyle. The media coverage Aileen received was often brutal and invasive, reducing her complex humanity to a simple, damning stereotype: the reckless, promiscuous, poor little rich girl who got what was coming to her. There was very little public sympathy or nuanced understanding of the complexities of the virus, her personal situation, or the simple fact that she was a human being facing a terrifying illness. Her story from this era highlights the brutal double standards so often applied to women, particularly those in the public eye, whose personal lives and health struggles are treated as public property to be dissected, judged, and consumed. Another area of complex interpretation lies in her relationship with her family, particularly her father, Sir John Paul Getty Jr. His decision to publicly cut off her trust fund during the depths of her addiction was presented at the time as a desperate act of tough love. From one perspective, it can be seen as the action of a tormented father trying any means necessary, however clumsy or harsh, to save his daughter from certain death. It's a narrative of paternal desperation. However, from another, more critical viewpoint, it can be seen as a cold, punitive, and deeply humiliating act of abandonment, a public continuation of the emotional neglect that had characterized the Getty dynasty for generations. It raises the timeless and agonizing debate about the nature of enabling versus supporting a loved one in the throes of addiction. Was it a misguided attempt to help, or was it the final devastating rejection from a family she already felt profoundly estranged from? The truth, as is so often the case in family tragedies, likely lies somewhere in the complex, painful gray area between the two. Aileen's survival and her eventual reconciliation with her father before his death in 2003 speaks volumes about her own capacity for forgiveness and her powerful refusal to be defined by the wounds of her past. She chose empathy over bitterness, a decision that would become the cornerstone of her life's work. The long-term significance of Aileen Getty's story, the reason she matters beyond the lurid headlines of her family's past, lies in her extraordinary and inspiring ability to transmute personal tragedy into a powerful, sustained force for positive change. She is not significant because she was a Getty who managed to survive the curse. She is significant because of what she chose to do with that survival. Her life stands as a powerful testament to the idea that our deepest wounds can, with courage and intention, become our greatest strengths. After stabilizing her health against all odds, she embarked on a new chapter as a deeply committed philanthropist and activist, founding the Aileen Getty Foundation. Her work is not the detached, arm's-length, check-writing philanthropy of many wealthy individuals. It is intensely personal, hands-on, and directly informed by the suffering she herself endured. Her most profound and lasting impact has been in the areas of HIV/AIDS awareness, addiction recovery, and homelessness. In 2005, she founded Get Love, a nonprofit organization dedicated to providing housing and comprehensive support to the homeless community in Hollywood. Her approach is rooted in a philosophy of radical compassion and personal connection, seeking to restore a sense of dignity, community, and belonging to those who have been forgotten by society. She didn't just fund these initiatives from a distant mansion. She has been on the ground, engaging with the people she is trying to help, listening to their stories, and treating them with the respect they deserve. Her ongoing work with the Elizabeth Taylor AIDS Foundation, where she now serves as an ambassador, brings her story full circle. She is continuing the legacy of the woman who helped save her life, ensuring that the fight against HIV stigma and the push for accessible care continues for new generations who did not live through the horrors of the early epidemic. More recently, Aileen has become a significant and vocal force in the climate change movement, co-founding the Climate Emergency Fund. This organization takes a bold and strategic approach, providing critical funding to grassroots activist groups like Extinction Rebellion and Just Stop Oil that are engaged in disruptive, nonviolent protest to demand urgent action from world governments. It is, to some, a controversial move, aligning her with a more radical flank of the environmental movement, but it is perfectly in character for Aileen Getty. As an heiress to a colossal fortune built on oil, she is now using that same wealth to fight against the destructive legacy of the very industry that created it. It is the ultimate act of rebellion and redemption, a way of rectifying the legacy of her family name on a global scale. Her story proves that it is never too late to change one's narrative, to take the circumstances of one's birth, no matter how privileged or how painful, and forge them into a tool for building a better, more just, and more compassionate world. In the end, the story of Aileen Getty is one of profound and inspiring transformation. She was born into a world of incredible wealth but deep emotional poverty, a world that seemed to doom its children to lives of tragedy and excess. She was the forgotten heiress who was supposed to be consumed by the Getty curse, but she refused to play her assigned part. She faced down public shame, a life-threatening illness, and a crippling addiction that brought her to the brink of death. And she emerged from that wreckage not broken, but reborn with a clarity of purpose that is as rare as it is powerful. Her life is a powerful rebuttal to the cynical notion that wealth corrupts absolutely, or that our past must define our future. For Aileen, her inheritance was indeed a toxic substance until she discovered the antidote, using it in the service of others. She transformed the lead of her own immense suffering into the gold of compassion and action. She is a living testament to the human capacity for resilience, the power of redemption, and the possibility of profound life-altering change. Aileen Getty's story is not about the curse she inherited, but about the blessing she chose to create for herself and for a world in desperate need of healing. She is the Getty who survived not by escaping her legacy, but by bravely, humbly, and beautifully reshaping it. We're done for today. Thanks so much for watching. If you found this helpful, smash the like button, comment below, and hit subscribe for more great content coming your way soon.